Okay, I am really excited because today we are going to be doing something that I've never done before, and that is revising an old project, a really old project. Because usually when I write a book, I edit it all the way through, I do all the drafts I need to do, and then I'm like, hey, it's done, put it aside, on to something new. But I've been having this nagging idea in the last year of revisiting the first thriller book I ever wrote. So from 2020 to 2025, I wrote one thriller basically every year. And this was the first one that kind of kicked everything off. And I learned so much while writing it that I feel like I want to go back and really give it the time and care to bring it up to my current day standard. So, as an example, when I was writing this book, I was pantsing, which is crazy now because these days I outline my books so much. But back then, I would just write and see where it takes me. And I had a lot of fun writing this book. But it was only as I was doing revisions that I figured out, oh, following a three-act story structure could help with pacing. Oh, having a character arc where a character is changing is usually a good thing to have and makes a reader care about and root for that character. So, as I was doing those drafts, I was slowly trying to figure this out and implement it in this book. But I feel like I really just want to take another stab at it. I'm so close to getting it to my full vision, but it just needs that little extra something. So, for some context, this is like an adult mystery thriller set in a remote field camp where somebody dies. And is it suicide or is it murder? Who knows? Who could it be? There's a small cast of characters, everything's isolated, lots of secrets, an unreliable narrator. So I was using all of these really fun tropes, but I also don't think I was using them to the full extent that I could have. But before I jump in and try and make any big changes, my goal is to do a full reread of the manuscript. So I'm going to be reading it on my tablet here, and then as I'm reading it, I'm also going to be taking notes. So I don't know exactly how this is going to look like because this is my first time revisiting an old project, but I just want to be able to write down any thoughts I have on changes, as well as I want to summarize every single chapter for myself because I imagine I'll want to do some sort of outlining before diving into another draft. So I wrote 5 drafts of this project, and the fifth version has 72,377 words, which is a great word count. I feel like it's a little bit on the low end in terms of like thriller books. I think thriller books kind of go from 70 to 90, but I would love to keep it short and just fast paced and moving constantly. So the first step will be giving it a read and seeing what we're working with. I've just completed the first 3 chapters, and it's kind of funny because I can distinctly remember writing the opening sentence and some of the descriptions in those first chapters. And I can even remember like my thought process of why I wrote things specific ways. But there's a lot I would want to change, even if I keep the scenes the way they are, just because I feel like in some places it's overwritten, in other places it could use more description to like tell you what's going on and where the people are and what things look like. But additionally, I just feel like I dole out way too much information off the bat. And in like a thriller mystery, I feel like I should be holding things back so that way I can like breadcrumb them through as like little answers to things or little mysteries to kind of carry you from chapter to chapter. And then additionally, I think I start the story a little bit too early. Like I could get rid of a lot of the first chapter and have it start out a little bit more with a bang, and then also try and craft the first sentence, first page to really hit hard one of my main tropes that I'm using. Rereading this book has been an experience, and I'm only a third of the way through. I was actually about to get to some reading tonight. It was supposed to be chill, I was supposed to be winding down for the evening, but then I was struck with an idea. But I have to be careful because I had another idea yesterday, and part of this is because I've been doing a lot of reading of thriller books that I have kind of been putting off for a long time until recently. So I just binged a whole bunch of them. And so I have to be careful that I'm not taking twists and things that I really liked in those books and just try and like replicate it in mine. and it doesn't actually fit there. So the first idea I had yesterday, it kind of sent me for like a little bit of a loop, and I wasted a whole bunch. Well, it wasn't wasted time. Like, all this is fun, all this is part of the process. But I spent a bunch of time thinking it through how it could be implemented before finally realizing, no, it doesn't really fit in this story. Like, it kind of overcomplicates everything because it's so easy to be like, oh, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this person who isn't who you thought they were, and this thing isn't what you thought it was, and just adding layer upon layer. But it all has to like make sense. It all has to like serve the story, serve a purpose. Like, I don't want to have a twist just to have a twist. Like, I want it to all click together, fit together. I want the reader to leave the book with a good understanding of what happened and without questioning a lot of stuff. Like, I want it to feel cohesive in that way. While yesterday's idea was a bit too crazy, I think that the idea I came up with just now will be really, really cool and also solve an issue that I've been seeing in this first third of the book. One of the glaring issues in my writing when I don't outline is that I struggle to get to the point. I just kind of wander around in all the different directions before like something finally happens. And I tried, like, I can literally see the ways that I tried in the past to improve this, because as I'm reading this, I'm also getting reminded by all the major red flags, all the major things I was trying to work on in this book. And I don't think I accomplished it as well as I thought I did because I wasn't willing to scrap things as much as I am now. And that's not to say I want to delete big swaths of the beginning of this book, because I think it could still be used as like scenes later on. Because one of the most important things when establishing like act one of a book is giving the reader promises, is telling the reader, this is a mystery book. This is going to be an investigation. This is going to be, okay, I guess I'm giving you some spoilers. Like, she has to go on this investigation to figure out this thing. But why is it that it's not until what, chapter 6, I think, that she's like starting this investigation? What are we doing in chapters like 1 through 5? If I'm being generous, maybe chapter 1 sets something up, maybe chapter 2. Then what are we doing chapters 3 through 5? Like, we need to get a move on. Like, she needs to start investigating and making that decision so much earlier. And so those other scenes can happen because I think they serve a purpose of introducing other characters, introducing other conflicts, but like, we need to start making these promises a lot earlier. And I think that I can do that using the new idea I have. But I think it's going to take a bit more mulling over to try and figure out how to make it work. So I've written down in my notebook for now the like rough idea of what I can do with it. And so I just need to keep reading. And who knows, maybe more things will spark from this. It took me 3 days to do a full read through, and I'm happy that I was able to finish it in such a short period of time, because I want to get like a good idea for like the scope of the story without taking too many breaks in between. So I've got plenty of notes, I've got plenty of ideas that I've written down and have been mulling over. And so I think I'm ready to tackle what comes next. So originally I thought I would just jump straight into doing outlining, because even though I don't really want to do like a full like scrap everything and restart, because there's a lot of things I really like about this story, especially once I got to the second half. I think the first half, the first third, needs a lot of work, but the final half of the book, especially the third act, I feel like flows really well. It's so fast paced. We're jumping from like thing to thing to thing. It's all these dominoes like falling over, and there's just so much momentum there that I really love. But I do think I'll be tweaking some of the like character motivations, some of the backstory, which may influence a little bit how it plays out. But for the most part, I want to keep what's there. But I don't want to get too distracted by that with the plotting. Like, I want to have a vague idea of like how the story goes, but I really want to approach my outlining to just be, what is the best story I can tell in these circumstances? I know I talked before about potentially starting the book a little bit later, but I've actually considered starting the book much earlier. I'm going to do some mild spoilers here, but there's a member of the team who dies. And originally, in my very first draft, I had the story start right before that person dies and then keep going. And then when I was doing revisions, I was like, I need to jump right into like more momentum, I guess. So I had it start when like the company they work for, the police officers were then there questioning them about it. And then you'd kind of be told what happens in flashbacks. And even now, I'm kind of like going back and forth about which is the best starting place. But I think I am going to write it from the beginning of that morning before the death happens and see how it feels. Because I think this is one of those situations where I won't know until I actually do it. But I have so many ideas for all the things I want to change. But I think that's why doing an outline is so important, because it'll keep me on track of like, what is the purpose of this story? And then where can those ideas support and benefit the purpose without distracting from it? But before I even go into the outline, because I really want to make sure that I'm not just like throwing 1,000 new ideas into this book and making it overly complicated, is I want to write a blurb, or what you'd write for a query letter when you're trying to like query a literary agent to traditionally publish. But I want to write it for myself. So that way I'm describing like what is the main character and their stakes. A lot of times you'll also describe a little bit like of the setup of the book. But I think by trying to understand what are the big selling points and the things I want to focus on in a blurb, that'll help focus me when I then go to outline. So that way I'm paying attention to and like being on track with like the promises I'm making in the blurb, if any of that made any sense. First step is just writing this really short blurb, which is obviously easier said than done, because that almost is like the more difficult thing to do. But I just haven't done this before for a book where I've written a blurb or a query letter before I've even written the story itself. But I've heard of like published authors doing that, so there's got to be something to it. Writing a pitch is not easy, or a blurb or a query letter. Like trying to summarize a huge 70,000 word story into like 200 to 300 words. But I think it's really important, and I think it really helped me because it really nails down like what are the major beats that need to happen to set up this story. Like what is it you're trying to sell someone to read this story? Like what are the tropes? What are the tension that they can expect, the conflicts that they can expect? And by writing this, actually the last sentence that I wrote kind of changed the game for me a little bit. I have like a new thing I want to play with that was never there in the original story all the way through drafts 1 through 5. I think it's really strong. There's a couple of things that I'd had ideas of doing that I think have now been pushed to the wayside just because it won't fit in this story, but I'm keeping those written down for maybe later when I'm trying to brainstorm another thriller, like maybe they'll fit there instead. But I went straight from writing the pitch to going into the outlining because I didn't really want to overthink it. I just wanted to do it without talking about it too much. And now I've completed almost 4 different outlining types. If you've been around since like the start of my writing channel, the first project I worked on was the mountaineering thriller, and I started with describing my outlining, brainstorming, plotting process. And I'm basically doing the same thing here because that's a process that I developed on the back end of writing this book. And it was mostly set in place starting with the second thriller that I wrote. But I was looking back through my documents and I never actually did like a full outline for this first one, even as I was learning these things. So I think what I was doing at the time was just like literally just trying to like write the book and implement it without actually sitting down and like writing out what each of like the plot points and things should be. So let me explain my outlining process. Basically, the intent of this is to make sure that I'm delivering to the reader what they expect when they pick up the book. And that is not to say that I'm writing to a market, to a person, to a trope necessarily, because you are creating the promises that you then have to deliver on, right? So if I didn't want to do a romantic subplot, if I didn't want to have to write any romance in my book, you just don't introduce it in the beginning. If you've made a promise, you have to make sure you're fulfilling it, or else the reader will be unsatisfied. While you can play around with what those promises are, depending on what genre you're writing, depending on what your setup is, there is one non-negotiable, and that is creating a really strong character arc that is the backbone of the story. So making sure that at least your main character is going to be changing across the course of events, that we're following them as they learn about themselves, and the person who finishes a story is not the same person who starts it. So one of the first things I always do when plotting a story is using a 3-act character arc. And I found the one that was created by Abby Emmons, who's here on YouTube, to be the best for that. And that's just a very basic outline where, first you have your hook, we're introducing your protagonist's inner conflict. Then you have an inciting incident, which is pushing that protagonist outside of their comfort zone. And that comfort zone is restricted based off of like their inner conflict and how they feel about themselves and potential misbelief. Then you have the build up where the character is then dealing with the inciting incident and having to make an impossible decision. And then they make that decision, which then determines what happens next. You go into Act 2, and there's a big game-changing midpoint, and then they change slightly because of the midpoint, and then we're going into Act 3, where they might have a supposed victory, where they think they've overcome whatever obstacles they have, but then everything goes wrong, and then the protagonist feels hopeless in this dark moment, and then they have an aha moment. That's the culmination of the entire character arc, where they're like, I have now realized and had this epiphany about myself based off of like, you know, all the things I've experienced in the story so far. And then with that new change, they're then able to enter the climactic confrontation against their like villain or just whatever antagonistic force is there. But now that they've changed, they're able to enter it with like a new vision and come out victorious, and then you have a resolution. This is a really basic 3-act story structure, but it's really important for me to have it so that way I can layer on everything else afterwards. And even though I want to make a ton of changes to the first third of this book, I've actually found that my 3-act story structure has remained really similar. So I'm doing the same internal conflict, I'm doing the same misbelief, they're learning the same things by the end, because if I want to keep the end the way it is, like this internal conflict is so baked into the final confrontations, the final decisions, the final resolution. And I do really like this internal conflict because it is a little bit gray in the sense that it's like she makes some decisions at the end that the reader might not be on board with if this arc isn't written properly. So once that is done, the next thing I look at is making sure that my story has all of the beats that a reader would expect for a thriller. And then for that, I use a thriller beats that were created by Alexa Dunn, also here on YouTube. A lot of these beats are actually really similar to the 3-act story structure. Like we start with a setup where we're establishing the status quo, like we would with the hook in the 3-act story structure. There's a disruption of the status quo, which is the inciting incident, also in the 3-act story structure. But there's also things in here that are important for building suspense, building stakes, building an investigation. So for example, they need a specific scene where they decide to investigate. There could be a B plot or partner in crime that comes in to help. They need red herrings, points of investigation, potential loss of a sidekick, or the sidekick becomes suspect. There's all these other things. And I find it useful to do this second because then I can take the 3-act story structure, what I know my like main points to be, I can put those in and then figure out what the order of the other beats need to be kind of between that. At this point, I have my character arc, so I know my character change. And then on top of that, I've layered these thriller beats, which then make sure that I'm satisfying the genre that I'm writing in. And then from there, it becomes a little bit looser because every thriller that I write has slightly different promises that it's making. This idea of promise and payoff is something that I take from Brandon Sanderson, and this is how he outlines. He is a fantasy author who also has YouTube videos. Basically, you want to identify what the other plot promises that you are making. And so for me, for example, my main character is unreliable. So then under kind of unreliable narrator, I then make a list of all of the possible things that could satisfy the promise of having an unreliable narrator. So I don't just want to say in chapter 1, yeah, she's unreliable, and then like not show it anywhere. So I need to make sure that her being unreliable is showing up time and again in the book and having an influence on what's going on. It's also an isolation thriller, so also making sure that I'm including things that play into the trope of it being isolated, no escape, we're contained, small group of people, suspicions are coming up, that sort of a thing. So those are the 3 outlines I usually do. But if you remember, I talked about a 4th one. Because as I was completing these 3 outlines, I had a ton of ideas. I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know the order that I wanted them in, especially from like the back part of Act 1 to the midpoint. I had all these different things that I wanted her to do, all these different things that I want to have happen based off of all of the plot promises. but I just didn't know how to structure it in a way that would like keep a reader engaged and kind of keep that momentum going. I decided to pull in a fourth type of outlining I've also never done before. See, we're just experimenting. We're just having fun with this book, really. I watched a video by C.F. Clare where she described how she uses an 8-sequence outlining method for her novels. And what this does is it breaks the book into 8 sequences. So it's like 2 sequences in Act 1, 4 in Act 2, right, with the midpoint splitting those, and then 2 for Act 3. And then in each of those sequences, you basically have like their own little mini arc. Each of the sequences, you have a setup, inciting incident, midpoint, inevitable scene, and then climax. Almost like building in these little like rise and fall actions within the big rise and fall of the entire book. And I found this to be really helpful, especially in Act 2 pre-midpoint, to figure out how to organize them to give these little rise and falls of action. Now I'm just finishing out really quickly the 7th and 8th sequence, and that should be pretty simple because I'm basically just keeping what's already in that 5th draft that I reread. And then once I do that, I want to do a chapter by chapter outline. I am continuing the theme of going a little rogue. So before this, when I was doing a chapter by chapter outline, I used an Excel sheet. I can link the video where I did that because I didn't do that this time. So typically with the Excel sheet, I would make every column a chapter in the book. I usually have then a row underneath that would say like the time, so time of day, just keeping track of like how many chapters are happening in a day. Does it make sense sequentially? Like, should it be night and not morning or whatever? And then after that, I'd have a row for like the main plot. And then every row below that would be related to one of the outlining methods I use, or maybe like a full plot promise, just to make sure I'm consistently hitting those marks all the way through. And I started to do that, but for some reason, it just didn't feel right. So instead, I pulled out that 8-sequence outline where I had the 8 blocks of 5 beats in each one. And those 5 beats are related to, the rising and falling of that sequence. And I made basically each one of those its own chapter, which then has left me with 40 chapters. So 8 times 5. Yeah, that makes sense. So I have 40 chapters now. And actually, originally, I only had 22 chapters in this book, so my chapters were way too long. Not obnoxiously long, like if I was in a different genre, I think they would fit right in. But for thriller, where you want things to be a little bit more fast-paced, it was definitely on the long side. So I'm happy that I've basically doubled my chapter count. And then as I'm writing these chapters, I'm going to keep a lookout for places where I can split the chapter even shorter, just because I want to try this as like an experiment, as trying something different with my writing to see how that affects pacing. I basically expanded each of those points in the 8-sequence outline to include a little bit more detail, going back through my other outlines to make sure I'm incorporating the important beats from those. But then I also tried to identify for each chapter a cliffhanger that I could end on. And I want to be careful here because cliffhanger, I think, can mean different things to different people. There are a few different ways that I'm trying to craft these cliffhangers because I don't want them to just be like cheap little like one-offs of like, ooh, someone's there, and then the next chapter, oh no, someone isn't, or like that kind of a thing. I'm trying to have them be a bit more built in, and how I'm doing that is being careful about where I'm breaking chapters. So for some of them, I'm just putting the chapter a little bit earlier. So when a piece of information is about to be revealed, just throw in a chapter break there, and then at the start of the next chapter, we're going right into that. Or in some of them, I do have the reveal at the end of the chapter, but it leads you to another question. It leads you to wanting to know what the consequences of that reveal is, and then that's what's being tackled in the next chapter. So always trying to leave chapter with some kernel of interest, of some question that they want answered, and they're going to have to read the next chapter to get that answer. I feel a lot more free with this project. I don't know why, to just like try new things, to see what happens. It feels like low consequence. So we'll see how this skews like my pacing and things like that. So we are so close to actually starting to draft. But the final thing we will do to prepare for the drafting is I want to go back through the old book and just copy paste over the scenes that I know will work really well here. And I'm not going to actually like edit them to the way they need to be here. I'm just going to plop them into the place where they would need to be under the chapter header of where they would be. And then when I actually start drafting, that's when I'll also go in and do the edits. I've officially copy pasted over about 36,000 words from the draft 5, the one that I reread. There will actually be quite a bit of rewriting required, but it's not going to feel like a total first drafting experience because I have a really good idea about the characters, the setting. Like I can see the whole book as like a movie in my head, so I'm not going to be struggling to figure out details. Hopefully it's not going to be too much of a challenge, but we shall see. There's nothing to do now but just start writing. So thank you for following along on this journey of us trying to figure out how to make this book better. And I'll see you in the next one when we actually start writing new words.